Hi, and welcome everyone to the discussion portion of the third class in the LaRouche Pack class series on the new paradigm, following our class last week on the topic of Are You Human or Humean? So I'm joined in the studio by my friend and colleague Dennis Small, who gave the presentation last week. And tonight we're joined by two live audiences, one in Houston, Texas, and another live audience in Detroit, Michigan. So we will be happy to take questions and comments and engage in discussion with them. So hopefully everyone watching got a chance to see Dennis's presentation last week, where he followed Lyndon LaRouche in going straight for the gut, straight for the axioms underlying the policies of geopolitics, which really lies in a way of thinking about the nature of man and man's relationship to the creator, and therefore the physical universe. And also, hopefully, people got a chance to do the reading assignment that the reading that Dennis assigned and was posted on the LPAC site, which were excerpts from Gottfried Leibniz and David Hume, and also to answer the homework questions. And we know that many of you did. We had over 24 direct responses. And I would encourage more people in the following classes to send in homeworks. Try doing the homework assignment. You get so much more out of the class when you're forced to really grapple with what you know and what you think you know. Now, the purpose of tonight's discussion is exactly that, a chance to discuss in a slightly more relaxed atmosphere the homework assignment, the presentation itself, the reading, and to give Dennis a chance to respond to the homeworks that you guys have sent in. So over the course of tonight, we'll be taking questions, as I said, from the live audiences in Detroit and Houston, and we'll also be taking questions and comments and thoughts from those of you watching on the internet. And the way those of you who are not in Detroit and Houston can participate is to call into the conference line, and the information for that is on the class series webpage. And I'll say something a little bit more later on how you can get into the queue to ask your question. So I think that's it. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dennis, who's going to give a quick overview or recap of the subject at hand, and then we'll delve straight into the homework questions.
Yeah, I'll do that. Let me just clarify that this discussion is, so to speak, off the record. That is to say, it's not being broadcast live on YouTube or anything of the sort. And the idea of that, with the organization of this whole class series, is to facilitate as much as possible a kind of give and take, an exchange of thinking and ideas and so forth around the topics that have been presented. I think I will proceed similarly to the fashion in which we did after the last class, which is to give a quick summary of the major points, what I consider the major points that I hope to communicate in the presentation. And then I want to go into some of the questions and the answers around the homework. And then open up for discussion, questions, disagreements, even agreements if there are such. The subtitle of the class, I think, is the point I want to emphasize, which is that this is the philosophical underbelly of geopolitics. In other words, it's kind of the Achilles heel. This kind of radical British empiricism is the weak point through which this outlook can and must be attacked and destroyed. This is not an academic exchange of views. First of all, this is at a far higher level than any university's discussion in point of fact. But it's really by way of a war council. In other words, what we're talking about here, this is a political movement. This is the LaRouche movement that's organizing this class series with the intention of training people, training ourselves, educating ourselves to be able to in turn educate the population and take on the problems that we encounter in the organizing. And some people sometimes view this as a little bit strange that in discussing organizing problems, we insist on discussing things at the highest level, the most profound philosophical issues. But that's exactly how LaRouche has always gone about this. And that, in fact, is the only scientific approach that works, because you have to go to what is behind people's difficulty in understanding what you're saying to them in plain English or plain French or plain Russian or plain Chinese, sometimes even in plain Spanish, and they just don't get it. So there's clearly a underlying problem. So this is by way of a war council, really. So this underbelly of geopolitics is what I wanted to review in the first class, and I want to just single out 4 points. First of all, I began with Lyndon LaRouche's document on how Bertrand Russell became an evil man, because not just to discuss Russell, that would take a whole series of classes on its own, but because LaRouche there states something which is really pretty stunning and shocking if you think about it, which is that he points to the transition from David Hume to Jeremy Bentham in the period of the 18th century, of British empiricism moving into British radical empiricism of the sort that then evolved into utilitarianism of the Bentham sort, as not just the foundation of geopolitics, it is that, but as the key to the last 600 years of history. Now, that's a pretty strong statement, and LaRouche is prone to strong statements, as I'm sure you're well aware. But it's a very interesting point in history that he's singling out, and it's exactly that point where Hume goes over from a belief in habit and custom, or not a belief in it, I don't think he believes in it, but a statement of habit and custom as a quote-unquote solution to the problem of skepticism, which he develops inexorably from his starting point of sense certainty, or sense perception. But he points to this transition as absolutely decisive in the last 600 years. And LaRouche furthermore points out that this transition into radical British empiricism was designed to target for destruction 3 things. Number 1, the emerging role of France. Number 2, Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And number 3, the emerging American Revolution, the former British colonies in the Americas and what was happening there. So my reason for citing LaRouche on this was not simply on that particular point of those 600 years of history, but the even more fundamental underlying point of what LaRouche was saying, which is that it's ideas that make history. And that's something really fundamental, because that is, in fact, ultimately the most profound refutation of empiricism itself. So the very fact that LaRouche goes at it that way was critical. So that was point number 1. Point number 2 was the idea that the zero-sum game approach, which emerges directly out of Hume and out of Bentham and out of empiricism, leading into hedonism and so forth, is in fact the basis of geopolitics, that this is where it comes from, that the skepticism of Hume, who, by the way, just to locate this for a moment, again, I think his years are, if I'm not mistaken, 1711 to 1776, dies in the year of the Declaration of Independence. But he develops an extreme skepticism and an argument against cause and effect in any form whatsoever. And this type of argument, the idea that we know only that which we perceive, or what we can build off the building blocks of what we perceive, in fact carries with it implicitly and then quite explicitly, in the case of hedonism, the philosophy of calculus, a definition of human identity which is geopolitical, which is that of the law of the jungle, of a zero-sum game. We then turned, and this is the third basic point, to our refutation of these ideas, and we turned first to Nicholas of Cusa. And you may recall that I referred to these 4 levels of mental activity that Cusa develops, which he has organized in a hierarchical fashion, because they are in fact hierarchical in the way the human mind functions. At the highest level is God. The next level is the intellect. Below that is rationality. And below that is the level of the senses. And Cusa's argument is not simply that these 4 levels exist and really coexist, but that they are, one with respect to the other, incommensurable. That is to say, you cannot measure, he says, the intellect with rationality. You cannot measure God with the intellect. and so on, meaning you can only understand the lower level by proceeding from the higher level and not vice versa. So he has taken everything stated by Hume and Bentham and turned it on its head before they ever said it. And then our last point was discussing Leibniz and Leibniz's development of this Cousian idea, or this Platonic idea, that pointing to the fundamental distinction between man and the beasts, centering around this capability of the mind to generate actual infinites or real universals or discover universal physical principles. And that this capability, this demonstrated creativity, is in fact what creates and allows for free will to exist in man, that we can choose to do A or B, and that in turn is the basis for all morality. And what actually is developed out of that in Leibniz very specifically, perhaps more so than with others, is this idea that science and morality are in fact one and the same thing. That's absolutely there with Cousin as well, but Leibniz lays the basis for developing that even further in physical economy. And so that, I think, is a very important point, and with regard to Leibniz, the issue of happiness as not just distinct from, but completely counterposed to the idea of pleasure. His concept of happiness, as in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was something that we also discussed. Okay, so that just by way of a little bit of mental calisthenics and to remind people of some of the topics that we addressed. And turning to the issue of the homework assignments. Now, I mean, most people had trouble and struggled with this. And I think that's really good, because these topics, these issues, have been the concepts over which the greatest minds in human history have struggled for not centuries, but millennia. It's not a simple multiple choice question and answer. It's not a simple thing of remembering something you were told. It's a question of creating inside your own mind concepts which, as I say, have occupied the better part of the lives of the greatest thinkers of humanity. So if you had a little trouble with this, that's good. That's not bad. And I don't think, I mean, in one sense, there of course are, I believe, right and wrong answers to this, but the struggle to find a way to think about this is really good. And I think that by and large, people did that. There was one case where that didn't happen, and I want to single it out, not by name, but I want to single it out because it really pissed me off. And that is that someone decided to simply send in total plagiarism. I mean, if they had bothered to plagiarize LaRouche, to quote some of Lynn's great writings, maybe they would have read it and it would have added something. But they actually sent back to us cut and paste from Spark Notes. I mean, really, who do you think you're kidding? Otherwise, I think that the problem that emerged in a number of cases was when people ran into a difficulty. Many people said, listen, I'm having trouble with this. And they actually came back at it again and again, which was good. But in some cases, some individuals dealt with that problem by changing the subject. This is commonplace. I'm sure you've run across it in your organizing, where you tell someone something that they really have trouble digesting, or as they say these days, getting their mind around. And so they changed the subject. Yeah, but what do you think about gun control? As if the entire universe revolved on that issue. Or, I demand to know your position on Me Too. Or whatever, any particular single issue topic, in order to take the intellectual stress off, pressure off themselves from dealing with the topics which you've presented. And some of you did that on some occasions in this. But by and large, I think that people really did make an important effort to go at this. Now, it's interesting that of the four questions, the one that everybody answered was the first one. Not sure if that's because it came first, and so people did that and then didn't get around to all the others. But nonetheless, everyone did answer that. And I want to, in each of these cases, I'm going to read to you, actually I'm going to put on the screen in a minute, 2 or 3 of the answers. I'm not putting them up there because I think these are the best answers necessarily. So don't jump to conclusions. Think about what other people said in response to this as you thought yourself as you were working on these homework assignments. So you'll recall that the first question was this quote from Leibniz, which he wrote in one of his essays, and in fact the essay is the Meditation on the Common Concept of Justice from 1702. And what I quoted to you was this from Leibniz. He said, "It is agreed that whatever God wills is good and just. But there remains the question whether it is good and just because God wills it, or whether God wills it because it is good and just. In other words, whether justice and goodness are arbitrary, or whether they belong to the necessary and eternal truths about the nature of things." So let's take a look at one of the first answers that I wanted to show you, if we could have that on the screen. This is a response coming from Marcel, and he said the following: "God has, in effect, made self-evident to us what the good is and why it is superior through the creation of a universe of which we are a conscious interactive part, so that we can know, as opposed to merely accepting by fiat or decree, the order and nature of the good. By creating a universe which is biased towards the good and human beings which have a notion of the good, God demonstrates lawfully why the good is both necessary and eternal." Now, I think this is a very interesting answer, and I think it definitely points in the right direction. Most of you, incidentally, did say that you thought that that goodness and justice were eternal truths which were knowable to man, not a result simply of God's arbitrary decision to do what he does. I'm not quite sure what Marcel meant here by self-evident. It's a question as to what he meant by that. And I'm also not quite sure what he meant by the universe being biased toward the good. If what he was getting at is that the intrinsic nature of man is fundamentally good, then I certainly agree with that. The reason for that is not because we've got some chip in us which makes us do good things, but because we're potentially creative, and creativity is good. Okay, answer number 2 is the following to question number 1. This is from Krista, who says, "They," meaning the good and the just, excuse me, "belong to the necessary and eternal truth about the nature of things. On the level of God's existence, there is no good or evil. It is. Good and evil exist only in the dual world." Well, here I have a question also, in fact, a bigger one, because about how on the level of God's existence there is no good or evil. I mean, if the idea here is that God is not evil, and we're not talking about a Manichaean world, yes, indeed, that is the case. But if we're saying that in the totality of creation, all of God's existence, it's simple, that it only is, then I think there's some problems here in terms of a certain kind of dualism which is creeping in. You'll see what I mean in a minute. The third answer is a slightly longer one from Mary. She says, "From my point of view, Leibniz is asking here if there is such a thing as truth. If nothing is knowable, and in fact no thought can really be said to have its own dignity, much less the human having the thought, then all of God's creation is reduced to a playing field of the devil, in effect, because there will be no sense to any human activity, no way in which to judge it, and therefore no comeuppance for any reprehensible behavior on the part of man. It can be seen that the activities of even the evil can be seen to follow absolutely the direction of the Almighty, despite their not believing in him and instead following his competitor Satan." Now, this is very interesting. Now, I don't know if Mary is actually familiar with Leibniz's answer. And I'm going to read you Leibniz's answer to this question which he poses. She may well be, because Leibniz has some things to say which are somewhat similar to what Mary points out here in terms of the issue of the devil in particular. And this makes a very interesting point, because I think that the very statement from the outset that what Leibniz is saying, he's asking here, is if there is any such thing as truth, i.e., is there any truth knowable to man, or are we simply repeating what we are taught, or that which we memorize, which is what would be the case if everything that's good and just is so only because God does it. In other words, we have to simply follow instructions. And that is many people's fundamentalist view of God and their relationship to God, which is follow orders, as opposed to think. God's actual injunction to man is think. And if you do so, if you're actually creative, you will end up doing the good. There's reasons for that. What actually is the case is that the very nature of the universe which God has created is in fact intelligible to man. I mean, that's a fundamental point, and you're going to see that in what Leibniz has to say, but I'm a little bit ahead of myself here. I want to address this last point of what she had said here, which is that the direction of the Almighty sort of sweeps up into itself even those who would attempt to follow his competitor, Satan. And to that effect, I want to share with you a little very short poem, which I'm very fond of. It's not particularly profound, but it is in one way. It gets to a fundamental theological as well as religious point, actually. It's a little poem called Abjuring the Devil. And it says, I love to hear the devil moan when he thinks he's quite alone. Up in the sky or down in the sod, he whimpers softly, my God, my God. And that's kind of a point that Mary was making, and it certainly is a point that Leibniz is making as well, which is who's really in charge here, so long as we act along the basis of God's injunction to man to be creative. Now, let me walk you through with me Leibniz's answer to the question which he himself poses. And this is the question that he poses, which I read to you at the beginning. I'm going to skip past it. And he says the following. Excuse me. The former opinion, meaning that what God does is in effect arbitrary, which is to say it is he does it because it is good and just because he does it. And Leibniz says the former opinion would destroy the justice of God. For why praise him because he acts according to justice if the notion of justice, in his case, adds nothing to that of action? Moreover, this opinion would not sufficiently distinguish God from the devil. This is why certain persons, too devoted to the absolute right of God, have done wrong to the attributes which make God lovable, and having destroyed the love of God, they have left only fear. The goodness of the actions and productions of God do not depend on his will, but on their nature. Plato in his dialogues introduces and refutes a certain Thrasymachus, who, wishing to explain what justice is, gives a definition which would strongly recommend the position which we are combating. Parenthetically, Thrasymachus' view is basically might makes right. That's all that justice is. It's the view of the powerful. So Leibniz is combating and rejecting that. And then, never one to mince words, Leibniz says, a celebrated English philosopher named Hobbes, who is noted for his paradoxes, has wished us to uphold almost the same thing as Thrasymachus, for he wants God to have the right to do everything because he is all-powerful. And that is definitely not Leibniz's view. Leibniz's view is that God is all-powerful, but because he is all-powerful and all good, he does the good. And Leibniz says, this leads him to his concept of justice, and this has everything to do with geopolitics. One may ask what the true good is. I answer that it is nothing else than that which serves in the perfection of intelligence substances. Justice is nothing else than the charity of the wise. That is to say, goodness towards others, which is conformed to wisdom. And wisdom, in my sense, is nothing else than the science of felicity, or of happiness. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot more about this first point. I think Leibniz's answer is eloquent, and there really is not a whole lot that needs to be added to that argument. What I'll do now is proceed to the second point, the second question that we asked here, which was, which has greater ontological reality? Which is a more real being or existence? What is or what ought to be? How would you go about arguing the case to a modern follower of Hume or Bentham? And then my suggestion there was to reconsider question number one and your answer to it. Now, before well, let me just go to people's responses on this. I think that might be the best way, and then I'll have a few comments to say. Here's one of the responses. What ought to be has the greatest ontological reality, because what is will always change and can always be better, or become what ought to be. The world that ought to be will come into existence in a necessarily non-entropic way. Man, who is basically good and just, will eventually demand that the world be as it ought to be. Now, that's Jeff's answer to this, which I have to say, it's the right answer in my view, but part of the reasoning is off, and for a reason that I'll make clear in a minute. Let me just go through the other responses on this. The second one is the following. The second one is from Karen, who says both. I would say it depends on context. What is? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This doesn't mean that things can't be improved upon as ideas arise that will improve situations, relations. What should be? If it is broke, then fix it. If situations, relations aren't working, then we need to work in order to improve them. And the third answer comes from Pip, who said, what is a limited state. What ought to be is an infinite state. What is only seeing the present and does not include the future. We are creating the future as we go along, so we cannot have a future if we only see the present. That's why we have to extend credit for projects that will make the future better. Now, that last answer, I think, gets closest to the issue at stake here. Here's what the issue isn't. The issue in this question of is versus ought is not, the idea of ought is not, well, we ought to do things that are better. It's not, let's make things improved. Let's act ethically or morally or something like that. That's not the idea. And I think that was part of the problem in the first answer. It definitely is part of the problem in the second answer, which we looked at here, which is that, well, if what we have is okay, then it's okay. But if we can make it better, let's make it better. That is not what is meant by ought. When I asked what had a greater ontological reality, what I was getting at is, which is real? Is what is real? And I think part of the assumption in most of the answers was, yes, that's real. What I'm arguing, following Crusoe and Leibniz and LaRouche, is that what isn't real. What's real is ought, in the sense of man's ability to create the future. The future state of mankind has a greater ontological reality than the supposed is of the moment, because the is simply the result of past action, but in particular as defined by empirical or empiricist knowledge. So when you pose the issue of ought, you're going directly to the issue of man's free will and his creativity, which is why I was suggesting that people might want to rethink why I was asking the first question and their answer to that, because effectively these are the same points. Think of ought, for those of you who have studied Plato, as the becoming. Not existence, but the becoming. That's really what ought is for the creative species, which is man. On the third point, and I'm going to go past this quickly because I do want to get into the discussion period. The question, as you recall, was which of the following two statements is closer to the truth? A, the sun will rise tomorrow, or B, the sun will probably rise tomorrow. And then there was a fairly lengthy quote from Bertrand Russell, which I'm certainly not going to read through now. And the answer which I want to read to you on this one is Trudy's, who, after saying how she found this whole thing so convoluted and the argument so difficult to follow and so on, she said about Russell, he's stuck in logic and the imposed laws of motion from Newton, never having asked himself why things are the way they are and not another. The assumptions within his diatribe are so stupid. And I think that is a very scientifically precise statement. More can and should be said about this, which is that his fundamental assumption is that all that we can know is in fact what we perceive with our senses, and therefore knowledge and truth is simply a matter of probability. And this question of probability is extremely important in today's math, sciences, physics, and I shouldn't say science because it's not scientific, and so on and so forth. Let's get to the fourth question here. The fourth question was, can you think of various examples of win-win situations or relations? What is the emotional state of mind of those involved in them, as opposed to the emotional state of mind of players in a zero-sum game? Now, here's the first answer. This is from Girard, who says, if you realize that all is one, you cannot escape from the urge and need to feel responsible for all and everything. Everything that contributes to the well-being of mankind and the world, materialized wherever on earth, is a contribution to one's own happiness and well-being. In that sense, win-win situations are the only viable solutions to the problems of this planet. If for love's and truth's sake a sacrifice is demanded, like the father who eats less so that there is more for his child to eat, then even a seemingly less than win-win situation turns into something that is even more valuable than that. Second response, and this one is from Ray, who attempted to elaborate an idea of zero-sum game and win-win as applied to economics. And this is what he said about win-win. He said, this is reciprocity, the golden rule, in the exchange of goods and services. Each one gives to the others the fruit of their individual talents applied as self-realizing work. And in exchange, they get a reciprocal value of purchasing power, money, which enables them to choose a mix of specialized production from the others, which accords with their specific needs, both as inputs for their production as well as for their personal consumption. And then the final one that I want to share with you is from Doug, who said, in somewhat of a complaint or a criticism of the question, saying, I find it interesting that this question speaks of an emotional state of mind. That sounds very intellectualized. Interpersonal relationships can have this win-win quality, but only after an openness and trust is created. And there's a genuine interest in the other's being as well as one's own. This is true, too, in relation to a marriage in a very ongoing way. Working together, caring for each other, and sharing common values and goals can create a variety of win-win situations. Now, that last part, I think, is certainly true. But before I answer his comment about the emotional state of mind, let me just say again what I don't mean and should not be understood by win-win. Win-win does not mean I get something out of this, you get something out of this. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Right? That's not win-win. That view, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, that is the view of Old Scratch. That's actually Satan's view, which is, I'll give you something for this, okay? What actually is behind this is the same thing we were discussing in the earlier questions, but as applied to politics and strategy and economics, which is a kind of situation, a kind of sense of identity in which one's own personal self-interest and benefit resides in the betterment of others. It's not just, hey, let's make a deal, and this, we can work this out. It's that my greatest benefit comes from guaranteeing and ensuring the greatest benefit for all of humanity. Or, as was mentioned in the last case, in a marriage, one's spouse, or in the case of parents with children, it's another very good example of a win-win situation where what you are concerned about is the welfare of the other. This is the basis of the Westphalian system, which is the antithesis of geopolitics. It's the idea not of beggar thy neighbor, but of prosper thy neighbor. And it really is the fundamental belief, the Christian belief, but not only the Christian belief, of loving not only thy neighbor, but loving thy enemy. And I was just listening, as I mentioned in the class discussion itself, some comments of Martin Luther King's, and he does discuss this, and he says, well, what do we mean by love thy enemy? He says, I don't mean like thy enemy. You don't have to like him. You may not like him at all, but you have to love him in the same way as God loves all creation and all human beings. In other words, you have to think and act like God. You have to think creatively. You have to think from that standpoint. And that, I think, is the standpoint from which we have to approach the win-win question. I'll conclude my remarks on this by referring to this comment about the emotional state of mind, sort of why am I mixing in a state of mind with a question of emotions, and the complaint about this, and this is, in fact, a kind of conceptual segue into the next class and the discussion of creativity in music and the CCF and so on and so forth. Let me simply tell you what, or show you what Lyndon LaRouche has to say about this issue. In this same paper on why Bertrand Russell is an evil man, LaRouche says the following: seen with rigorous objectivity, Russell is a satanic bore. Precisely therein lies that Venetian monkish quality which made Russell, like the 18th century Jean Maria Ortiz, so dangerously influential among those whose impaired psychosexual sense of personal scholarly identity dwells within fantasies residing at or below their waistlines. So that, I think, should give you at least a hint as to why I referred to an emotional state of mind and why LaRouche has argued in great scientific depth that concepts and emotions are not two separate things. They're one and the same process in the human mind. So I'll stop there and pass the floor back to Megan and take it from there for discussion, comments, and so forth.
Exactly. So we'll open for our discussion period now. If you're listening online, you can email your questions in to classes@larouchepac.com, but we'd really like to hear from you. So better would be if you could call into the conference line. All the information is on the class page. If you get on there, or if you were already in the conference line and would like to ask a question or raise an issue, make a comment, you can dial *6 to get into the question and answer queue, and then we'll indicate when it's time to ask your question. So I'd really urge people to do that. We'd really like to hear from you. So before we go to our first question, which I'm going to take from our audience in Detroit, I'd just like to urge everybody to keep your questions focused on the topic at hand. There's obviously a lot that's worth discussing in the world today and on a lot of these subjects, but we really want to use this to hash out the things that Dennis has raised and their relevance to the fight today. So keep your questions focused on the homework, the reading assignments, thoughts Dennis has provoked during this discussion. And with that, we will go to Detroit for our first question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Dennis, you said something at the introduction of this class about the enemy's philosophy being their Achilles heel. And I'd like you to expand on that from the following standpoint. When we were reading the Hume, at a certain point, we took him extremely seriously because he said you can't know anything except from that standpoint of custom and what has happened in the past. So at that point, we figured we'd read everything we needed to read about Hume. We knew what he was going to say in the future. But from the standpoint that this idea that you can't know the future, you can't know principles, you can't know cause and effect. I mean, it kind of reminded me of Prometheus's poor brother. Prometheus in Greek means forethought. He had a brother that not too many people know about, literally, whose name was Epimetheus, which means afterthought. So he didn't have a very good impact on history. But this quality of radical empiricism, which the enemy has, I think is their Achilles heel. But I'd like you to expand on that a little more.
Yeah, no, that is the case. But let me turn it around a little bit. It's if we, in fact, not simply reject this, but understand why and how to reject this at the level of what Cusa and Leibniz and LaRouche discuss, then we are creating the enemy's worst nightmare. That's what they fear, and that's really the only thing they fear, which is why they've gone after LaRouche the way they have, the way they went after Leibniz the way they did, and the reason they killed Socrates and so on and so forth, is because they know at one level that it is in fact ideas, correct creative ideas, intersecting a political and a social process like the one that we're undergoing today, which is one of radical, dramatic changes. That's the most dangerous thing, and in fact, really the only thing which threatens their existence. So to be able to maintain the population in general in a condition of slavery or subservience or under control or not, I mean, after all, how many people are there in the establishment? I mean, how powerful are they really? I mean, they have $2 quadrillion, but what's a dollar worth? Nothing. I mean, dollar bills aren't even good to be the proverbial toilet paper. Doesn't work for that. Toilet paper is better than dollars. So what power do they really have unless people accept the kind of state of mind in themselves which leads to their own enslavement? And I think this is what Plato was getting at in the Republic, in the famous discussion of the cave, the slaves in the cave, who are like human beings, which is they look at these shadows projected on the wall of the cave, and I presume most of you are quite familiar with that as a concept, and they're unable to break out of that way of thinking unless they get an entirely different concept of what's actually going on here. And Socrates' entire purpose and Plato's entire purpose was to arm people with those ideas, that way of thinking, which is what made Socrates so incredibly dangerous, such that they had to assassinate him. And that's actually one of the reasons that I recommended that people take a look at Euthyphro. It's one of the 4 dialogues. I mean, it's actually, people may not know this. Susan can tell you a whole lot more about this than I can. She's a real Plato scholar. I've read some of this stuff and thought about it, but in the 4 dialogues of Plato around his trial and his death and so on, the Euthyphro is the first one. But I won't go into that at this point, except to say that what the enemy fears are those ideas. So on the one hand, this is the enemy's Achilles heel, in the sense that if we can educate people to think differently, think in a fashion like Beethoven thought, or think in a fashion like LaRouche thinks, then there is actually no way that the enemy is going to be able to contain our political movement and our ability to create an entirely new paradigm. So it's the enemy's Achilles heel in that sense, as well as the direct sense that underneath this supposed great power and all this military might and all of this economic might, supposedly, and monetary might, and so on and so forth, is a philosophical underbelly of ideas which are absolutely preposterous, infantile, and satanic. And if you got a sense of that by reading some of the Hume, and it sounds like you got more than enough of a dose of that in Detroit to reach that conclusion, then my purpose is served. But you have to be able to refute that in yourself and to recognize that much of the way we think, we as a nation and we as the people who are organizing and we as organizers, often the reflex way of thinking, and you can catch yourself making these mistakes and you can train yourself not to, but the reflex is often to think in these kinds of empiricist terms. By accepting single issue discussions and by accepting the emotional state of mind that is related to empiricism, which is one of a division between your private life and your public life. I mean, that's what LaRouche is talking about when he talks about psychosexual impotence, is that kind of a division where you're a different person in your private life and in your public life. And if your mind is organized around the idea of empiricism or a zero-sum game, what that translates into psychologically, just to put a fine point on it, is I'm going to get mine. You've all heard that, right? And you know what that means in interpersonal relations. So I think that this issue of the Achilles heel, we really actually need to think of in both of those senses that I was just indicating. I don't know if that addresses what you were asking about, Susan.
Yeah, turn the light on.
Yes.
Okay, so sounds like we have a question in Houston there.
Step back a little bit.
Hello. All
Hi.
right, good. So Dick Conley here, working on Keisha Rogers' campaign for Congress. But now, this question of how do you tell the truth, it came up over the course of talking with people on this campaign. A young person came up to our table and expressed doubt that we went to the moon. So, of course, we're down here in Houston where it all happened. And my answer to him was, the way you know what's a fact now is by the future. I believe I got that from Lyndon LaRouche himself, but I told him that Chinese are planning on returning to the moon and establishing a base on the far side of the moon where they could observe the universe without the interference from the Earth, the electromagnetic noise coming from the Earth. So this is the way you would find out what's a fact today. And just along those lines, Lyndon LaRouche is the top economic forecaster, and his forecast, which was a proposal of the SDI, was based on new physical principles. And in 1983, it was accepted by the American president, Ronald Reagan, March 23rd, 1983. To the third part of the Reagan speech, which was to lift a burden of mutual assured destruction, which was very real at the time. That's how, I figured we would all die in a nuclear war. But seeing the proposal to defeat ICBMs and the threat of nuclear destruction with new physical principles shared between the two superpowers, with the spin-offs going for the common aims of mankind, was such a relief. It was like a great weight was lifted off my shoulders. This concept of new physical principles, though, was not just something that was inherent to the United States, even as such, with our Constitution. It's now been adopted by the original partner that had rejected it originally. And President Putin now has essentially taken this SDI and reciprocally offered it to the United States in the form of negotiating an end to mutual assured destruction. So I guess my point is that the only way you can know the future, the only way you can know the present is if you live in the future about what you're creating, as Mr. LaRouche has done with his 9 forecasts, and what we're trying to do, with the 4 laws, with LaRouche's 4 laws, to get our economy going again, So anyway, I'll leave it at that. So you can comment on that, I guess. Yeah.
You know what the difference between a neurotic and a psychotic is? And this is well known in psychiatry and so on and so forth. The difference between a neurotic and a psychotic is that in the case of a neurotic, he has or she has certain absolutely predictable mathematical-like patterns of behavior and response which do not actually correspond to a creative form of activity. This isn't the definition you're going to get from anyone of neurosis other than from LaRouche and a couple of pretty sharp psychiatrists, but that it's a distance from creativity. But you can marshal facts and evidence and paradoxes and contradictions and metaphors and ways of thinking which can relieve or cause a conflict in the mind of that merely neurotic person such that they say, wait a minute, what's wrong here? Wait a sec, something's wrong. I don't get it. In other words, you produce simultaneously 2 contradictory things in that person's mind such that they have such a conflict that it leads them hopefully to a higher level of thinking. Most people are neurotic. Most people we organize are neurotic. And so on. But the difference with a psychotic is that there is no amount of simple metaphor or paradoxes or facts or information or anything of the sort that can possibly alter the way that their mind works, because what it does is that it absorbs into its own map, which is completely separated from the actual reality surrounding it. It absorbs into its own map anything which you care to offer, anything that you care to marshal in favor. So you have to have a completely different kind of approach with a psychotic than with a neurotic. What I'm getting at is that I don't know from your initial remarks whether the person who came up to talk to you about how we'd never gone to the moon was a psychotic or merely neurotic. And I would suggest that the first thing to do is to try to determine which it is in the organizing process. That is to say, to try to figure out some way of crossing his wires, saying something, figuring out some way of approaching this that will lead him to realize that he cannot continue to think that way without contradicting himself. And he'll either get totally enraged and kick over your book table, or he'll get really interested or something like that. If he's a psychotic, better call the guys with the butterfly nets, which is, unfortunately the state of a lot of people that we organize. So, I'm saying this only half in jest. I mean, this really is the problem that we're dealing with in addressing things with people. You have to try to figure out a way to get under their skin to what is actually causing them to think in this completely ridiculous, absurd kind of way. I'm not saying that what you did is inappropriate. That might have been a very appropriate way of doing that by talking about what the Chinese are doing or something of the sort. But you need to get under his skin or her skin in a way that confounds them and leads them to realize that they cannot hold that view without altering that view. In other words, to present them with a paradox that somehow or other is going to force them to a higher level. Training ourselves to think in that fashion, as we were discussing in the first question and answer, is very, very useful for this kind of organizing. For example, classical mathematical and formal logical paradoxes, which are not word games, but are actually very important ways of figuring out how people are thinking, is, for example, what do you tell me whether the following sentence is true or false? Okay, you ready? I want you to tell me whether the following sentence that I'm about to utter is true or false. This sentence is false. Did what I just said was true? Well, if it's true, then the sentence is false. But if it's false, then its content is false. So it's true. So if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. Very simple example. It is not a word game. This is not a semantical question. This takes you to the very heart of the paradoxes of mathematical thinking, or formal logical thinking, or neurotic thinking. So training ourselves to be able to deal with this kind of approach, and thinking instead from the standpoint of the coincidentia positorum, which the hint here is that's the way you actually can solve these kinds of paradoxes. There are many, many others which are very, very amusing. My favorite one is actually from Don Quixote of Cervantes, but I won't go through that. But this is the kind of way that we have to think to address these things. Just one brief comment, because I don't want to get off onto the issues of the day, what the Russians said and so on, not because they're not important, they're crucially important. But on this question of the SDI and the SDE, I mean, the Russians, they have something that's Mach 20. Besides their fireball plasma, which travels and can be guided at unbelievable speeds. But, this Mach 20 thing, which people have talked about. Well, Mach 20 is pretty fast. That's 20 times the speed of light. Well, I'm sorry. I'm ahead of myself. Thank you for correcting me. 20 times the speed of sound. Do you know how fast a beam weapon is? Do you know how fast a light travels? 50,000 times faster than Mach 20. More or less. Do the arithmetic. So when we talk about new physical principles, jumping to an entirely different level, you're talking about totally changing the parameters of everything that you're doing. And this is just one good example within the domain of strategic and military affairs. So let me leave it at that on that question.
Great. Okay, so we're going to go to the conference line for the next question. And just very quickly, for anybody in the conference line or watching on the internet who would like to ask a question from the conference line, once you call in, you dial *6 to get into the Q&A queue. So let's go to the conference line with Marcel.
Hello, Dennis. This is Marcel from Manhattan.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Dennis. Thank you very much for taking my call. And I have one quick reference to make, and then one important question, which I think you're the perfect person to ask about regarding something you said earlier. Now, in one of the responses that you read, and I apologize to everybody on the line if the response was not as clear as it could have been. When I was writing that the universe is biased in favor of the good, what I was meaning was that basically that God, the Creator, created a universe which we're a part of, in which we're able to not just be told or not just in some way know what the good is and have to do it because that's what it is, but in fact, what things that Leibniz talked about, like pleasure, in terms of true pleasure, real pleasure, lasting pleasure, things like beauty, things like harmony, things like joy, and that it's our natural instinct, it's within us to pursue that. But then as we pursue those things, and as we experience more of those things, and in a certain, again, long-lasting, beneficial sense, we can luxuriate in those things and raise the standard of our lives in every way. That's how we learn, in fact, what the good is. So therefore, the universe is basically as a classroom for us, so we understand the value and the substance and the comport of what the good is, as opposed to just obeying what we're told the good is. So maybe that clarifies things for that first part, and I apologize if I was unclear.
No need to apologize. It's fine. It's useful.
Now the second thing, and you did mention about you clarified something about, loving thine enemy or loving your enemy. As Martin Luther King Jr. had said, which I think myself included at times, and a lot of people, misrepresent. And you clarified it doesn't mean that you have to like them, that you have to see them in a positive way, of course, but that you treat them with the sense of human dignity. Now, I know that you're the co-author of a book that I just finished reading, published in 1993, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the book in front of me, but I believe it's The Plot to Destroy the Military and Nations of Ibero-America and South America, that you translated into English, and the second to last transcript by Colonel Mohammed Ali Senaldin of Argentina, I was just finishing up today, and I read the part of the transcript from his appeals hearing where he says, "I do not hate anyone." And he says to hate, or to be able to hate, means to lack reason. And I was trying to kind of situate that, especially given the circumstance that he was in and what exactly he meant by that. So since you brought up the context of loving thine enemy, I'm wondering if you could please just explain what you believe he meant most clearly by the idea that if you hate even something that's evil, I imagine that you lack reason.
Okay. Let me just go to your first point first, which is this concept of the universe and of man in the universe that Leibniz develops. I think one of the unstated, at least in that particular quote, but unstated points that Leibniz otherwise makes repeatedly is that he believes, for example, his discussion of the general characteristic or the universal characteristic. What he says is that man will be able to, at some point soon, he said, as he's developing and discovering the universal characteristic, to be able to know and talk about the entirety of creation with the same scientific certainty as we can now apply to a simple arithmetic sum. Now, what's he talking about here? What he's talking about is that he's absolutely convinced, and proves in point of fact, that God has created the universe in such form and shape and content, and man's mind within it, that man is actually capable of understanding and changing the lawful ordering of the universe. I mean, this is just an unbelievably profound optimism, and a scientifically based optimism on Leibniz's part. And he develops that faith and reason are identical in point of fact. They are the same thing. There can be no faith without reason, and there can be no reason without faith. And it's his concept of the nature of a creative, self-expanding universe created by God, and that God has endowed man with the capability of imitating God, not just in the sense of being in his likeness or something, like we're all going to go grow big gray beards or something like that, women included. I mean, that's not the point. The point on this thing is we are in God's likeness in the sense that we are capable of creative activity, as Leibniz says, each in our smaller domain, architectonically. And we are therefore capable, that God has organized the universe in such fashion that man is actually capable, it is an intelligible universe, that man is capable of understanding it and developing it and helping the process of creation. Now, that's actually the underlying concept of physics, of psychology, and of religion, of theology, that is implicit in this first quote of Leibniz's about what is good and just. That's actually what's there, which I think is what you were also addressing and getting at. There is an article of Lyndon LaRouche's, which I want to recommend everyone to read, and I think the title alone will probably, hopefully, get you really intrigued by what he discusses there. But the title is, "What is God that man is made in his image?" And I think it points to exactly the essential point that Cusa is making, which is the way you know God is by his reflected powers inside your own mind. There's one of the, not the layman about mind, but the layman on wisdom, or about wisdom, which has this great exchange, which I really, really like in Cusa, where there's a discussion between the layman, who is supposedly a very simple man, it's actually Cusa, and this great, brilliant philosopher or something like that, who just doesn't get it. And he says to the layman, but if God is ineffable, if God is beyond all concept, how can you form a concept of God, of something you can't conceptualize? How do you form a concept of God? And the layman says, paraphrasing, oh, it's very simple, piece of cake. The same way you form a concept of concept. Now, this is exactly what Cusa was talking about with these four levels that we were discussing before, which is you see the way your own creative mind makes you capable of understanding lower levels of reasoning and thinking, and you therefore understand by metaphor, by proportions, what God's nature must necessarily be, although you cannot know it directly. You have to look aside, the way Dante says. You can't look at the sun directly. So this is a very interesting concept, and that I think is one of the things that LaRouche goes out in this document about what is God that man is made in his image. Okay, Saint Eldine and the complot. I mean, there's all sorts of things to be said about this. I want to say two things about Saint Eldine. The most important thing about Saint Eldine, there are many mistakes and problems and so on. He was a military jarhead. And if anybody has worked with the military, you know what I mean. That wasn't bad. It was just limited. The single most important thing about Saint Eldine is that he profoundly respected and followed Lyndon LaRouche. He didn't get it all by any means, but he got enough to know that Lynn was right. And he had to associate himself with that and put his own knee-jerk reactions about things on the back burner and instead do what LaRouche said. And he did that. And that's one of the reasons that he was so hated, was because of his relationship to LaRouche. One of the things that Saint Eldine said, or did, that really scared the enemy very much in his case, wasn't so much his military capabilities and so on and so forth, but he was brought into Panama by General Noriega at one point in the, I don't remember, the 80s, maybe late 80s, something like that, to teach at the School of the Americas, which was then taken over by the Panamanians, teaching basically military command schools for the entire continent. In other words, he was lecturing aspiring colonels and generals and so on. And St. Eldine's opening discussion with his class was always the following. And he was immensely respected because he was a commando's commando. So that had everyone kind of, ooh. But that's not how he started. The first thing he said was, I have been married to my wife for 30-odd years, and I have never, in those entire 30 years, had another woman or touched another woman. Period. And that caused such utter chaos and commotion of exactly the sort he wanted in his audience. I mean, use your imagination, right? These are a bunch of young machos, right? Commandos from different parts of the continent. And here's this commando's commando, and that's the first thing he tells them. I mean, this is a good example of how you get under people's skin and completely freak them out. Because what is it about this guy? How does he think? What's going on here? And I would suggest to you, without going further afield in the question of what St. Eldine said at his final speech before he was convicted, a speech, incidentally, which my wife Gretchen and I were lucky enough to be at personally, to witness. We were in Buenos Aires at the time and subsequently visited St. Eldine in jail and so on and so forth. But I think that comment of his actually tells you, if you know how the mind works, more about him than volumes that I could otherwise tell you.
Okay, so I'm going to go to a question that's come in online, and then after that we'll go to Detroit to see if there's another question there, and then after that, Houston. So this question was sent in by Karen, who says, during last week's class, Dennis mentioned how important it is to know your enemy outside in our external world and also inside our own minds. For tonight's follow-up discussion, could Dennis speak more about knowing the enemy in our own mind? I would like to be able to identify when the enemy is operating in control of my thinking.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In one sense, that's been exactly the subject of last week's discussion and this as well. Our kind of reflex way of thinking in pretty much all fields, especially because this is the way we are taught in this society, not the way we would be taught, say, with a Humboldt curriculum or something like that, but educated the way we have been from grade school on up through high school and especially universities, because that's where it's the worst, is that you are inculcated with a way of thinking about the world which, on the one hand, tells you that what you know is what you see, or smell, or touch, or something which your senses otherwise communicate to you, or which you build up a knowledge of starting from those building blocks. People have a lot of trouble at first thinking about how you would go about it in any other way. But I mean, Plato has a couple of good examples of how you need to think about this the other way, which is, okay, if someone does something which is just, which is good, you can say, okay, that is a just act. And you could, if required to, point to that specific just act and say, okay, that's a just act. That's an act. It's something that you observed or perceived or heard about or what have you. But where does the concept of justice come from? Does it come from somehow or other adding up all of the individual just acts in the world that you've heard about or could hear about or could read about, sort of adding all of the dots to somehow get to the line? Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe man somehow, some way, has a prior concept of justice, which is a higher level concept than a specific just act, and that the way you know if something is actually just, a just act, is because it conforms to this very abstract idea of justice. I mean, what's justice? Describe justice to me with any one or all combinations of your 5 senses, or add another 10 senses if you like. I don't care. I mean, you know, imagine another species that has more senses than we do. And it's very possible, right? I mean, there are certainly areas of the physical universe which we don't detect directly with our senses. Just look at the way we're able to see out into the universe with different kinds of telescopes. You know, there are areas of the electromagnetic spectrum which are not accessible immediately, directly to the human eye. we have to approach them by using instruments. But fine, I mean, add another 5 senses, add another 10 senses, as many as you like. Can you possibly give an actual description or definition or present me a concept of justice that comes from any sensual perception of any sort? Clearly you can't. And no matter how far you extend into an imaginary other species, which could well be out there, which has many, many, many different senses, 5,000 senses, would that in itself allow you to develop a concept of justice? No, it would not. There's something about the nature of the concept justice, which seems abstract at first, but which is a higher order existence than a specific just act. And in point of fact, the way that you know that a just act is just is because your mind makes a mental comparison, a proportionality, establishes a relationship between that seemingly intangible, abstract concept, and I say abstract in quotation marks, concept of justice and a particular act, which allows you to say, oh, I recognize that. That's a just act. Why? Because it conforms to a concept of justice that I have. Now, people can have a wrong concept of justice, but nonetheless, you get the idea of what I'm getting at here. It's what Kuza and others say also about how there are no two circles in the real physical world which are actually identical. You can draw them as precisely as you like, but they're never the same. And they're actually not circles in point of fact. Just get a more powerful enough microscope and you'll discover that they're absolutely not circles in the least. But what allows you to say, okay, that's a circle, to recognize it as a circle, is you have a higher order concept previously in your mind. Plato calls it remembrance or memory, which is almost always misunderstood. And the more you read Spark Notes, the stupider you'll become about what Plato's actually talking about. It's much more this idea of having a concept which pre-exists sense perception, which allows you to order sense perception. And you can recognize something and call it a circle because it conforms to your concept of circle, or what Plato would call a form, or an archetypical idea, right? So the idea is actually of a non-material, I was going to say substantial, but that's the wrong word. It's not a thing, all right? But it's an idea has greater actual existence and reality than the particular objects which we say conform to it. And that's how the mind actually works. That's how creative thinking actually works. So I'm going through this example to give you an idea of how much we have to overcome in our own axiomatic way of thinking, in our own, what we just sort of do by knee-jerk reaction, because it's what's been inculcated into us, what we've been led to believe is the way things are, and then it's really drilled into our head because if you want to succeed, if you want to get a degree, if you want to pass your 6th grade exam, you'd better say things that the teacher agrees with. And especially if you want to get your college or university degree, and for heaven's sake, if you ever want to get a PhD, you cannot think. And if you do, you're flunked out and very likely thrown in jail as well, especially if you can really think. But that's the way it works. And these are the kinds of ideas which are actually behind the issue of geopolitics, which is why, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, what the British fear most, what this oligarchical thinking fears most, is people who break out of this empiricist or sense certainty dominated way of thinking to a totally different realm. And the single biggest obstacle to this is people's sense of identity, of who they are. If their emotional state corresponds to a creative state of mind, if their emotional state is one of love, of agape, not romantic love, not erotic love, not even filial love, but agape, the kind of love which leads God to say to us, love thy enemy. If that is your emotional state of mind, your mind will function creatively. So, this old rule, this what people say, oh, I'll believe it when I see it, is actually not only not true, the reality is the other way around. People will only see things when they believe it.
Okay, why don't we go to Detroit and see if there's a question there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I don't have it totally formed, but I think the discussion that you just had could maybe be applied instead of the idea of justice per se, the idea of win-win cooperation, like you were asking in the questions, because it's very easy to, like in any Plato dialogue, what is justice? And then the person he's talking to just rambles off a bunch of examples of just acts or something like that. I think the same thing with the idea. The ideal concept of win-win can be very easily reduced to just, an action which would benefit both parties or something like that. So can you present in some form I don't know, the higher ideal of win-win as opposed to just a example of it?
No, I think that's exactly the point. I mean, that's exactly the problem with the way most people think about win-win, is they think about it of, oh, let's do something which is in your interest and in my interest. Hold it. Interest, self-interest defined how? Right? If you're what's implicit in that concept, people presenting it that way, is they are still thinking of my self-interest being for me, myself, and I, numero uno. And your self-interest, that's you, that's your interest. And we can undoubtedly reach an understanding in something which will be mutually beneficial, right? That's, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that's not it. That's not the idea. That's not what win-win actually is. Now, I'm certainly not as well versed in the Confucian thinking. You'll hear about that from Mike Billington, I'm sure, in greater detail on this thing. But I know that that's not the way that Xi Jinping is thinking about this when he talks about win-win. It is not a question of, hey, I've got something which is good for me and good for you, as defined in terms of, standard definitions of self-interest. That's not the concept at all. The concept is a different concept, and it's a kind of leap that people have to make of exactly the sort as you were just saying, when you have to make the leap from thinking of individual just acts to the concept of justice. Win-win is, let me put it differently. Doing something which is good for me and good for you is still a zero-sum game, because the concept of the individual, the definition of identity, is still the same, which is, okay, let's find an area in which our egotistical self-interests overlap, right? Like a Venn diagram or something like that. Oh, let's find where these things overlap. Well, we can do that. But it's still the same definition of what the individual is, as opposed to a definition of the individual who views his or her greatest sense of identity and purpose in life as developing the creativity and the well-being of the entire species, and through that, the entire universe. And people have a lot of trouble with that because, not that it's such a hard concept to understand, but they don't want to apply it to their lives. The reason they don't understand it is because they don't want to understand it, because once you understand certain ideas, if you're half honest, you have to act on those ideas. So people prefer to say, oh, I don't understand. I just don't get it. Excuse me, that's way too deep for me. Because they don't want to have to act accordingly. They don't want to change their lives and to dedicate their lives to an entirely different concept of what human beings actually are. Because that then leads you to the rather uncomfortable position, and it is admittedly uncomfortable, of being prepared to suffer the consequences of fighting for those ideas in a world which is not governed by them yet. And it can mean, in the case of a university student suffering the opprobrium and the sneers and the attacks of his professor and of his classmates. It can mean, in the case of a younger person who's in junior high or high school, some guy who's, likes to think and read and so on. Well, the girls aren't going to like him. That's dangerous stuff. You don't want to do that. Or in the case of a young woman who's an intellectual, or you definitely don't want to look smarter than the boys. You'll never catch a husband. You'll scare them all off if you act smart. Don't act smart. Suppress it, right? All of these are the kinds of social pressures that come to bear. And then at the university level, as we discussed, and then, more profoundly, if you fight for these things, as Martin Luther King did, he was assassinated. First, the FBI tried to blackmail him. That didn't work. And then so they killed him. And it was the FBI and people working for those same interests. Or you end up in the situation that Socrates was in. Or you end up going to jail like LaRouche ended up going to jail, right, with a 15-year sentence. Sometimes fighting for these kinds of ideas can get uncomfortable, dangerous, and even worse. But if you realize and come to an understanding and look at the history of humanity and see just how important these ideas actually are, you come to a resolution that, with yourself, that some ideas are worth fighting for and suffering the consequences. And that's usually the obstacle in this case to people actually understanding these things, is that they, it's not that complicated intellectually. It's very complicated in terms of personal identity and what people do with their lives. And what you'll find, I'm sure you found this as an organizer, is that the real conceptual obstacles you come up with people it comes down like a metal fence, right? An iron wall, right? At the point where the implications of what you are presenting to them starts to have consequences for what they need to do with their life. And that's when they say, no. And then they start inventing. People get really creative. They invent disagreements and excuses. And I disagree with LaRouche because he said, and they'll spend hours and hours poring over LaRouche's documents to try to find one phrase that they can convince themselves that they disagree with. I found on page 426 of LaRouche's document, written in 1826, on the third sentence, he ended with a comma and not with a period. I cannot possibly agree with that. Therefore, I'm not going to do anything. You ever run across that argument? I mean, that's effectively what happens with people, right? So they come up with all of these reasons that, you have to sit back and marvel at the unbelievable creativity that people come up with to invent excuses to sit on their ass and to not understand. Oh, I don't understand what you're saying. So that's the problem that you're actually dealing with here. So this also goes back to the earlier question of what is the enemy in our own mind that we're dealing with. It is an emotional state of mind. It is not simply ideas. It is an emotional state of mind. So what you have to do is you have to replace an infantile, Hobbesian, aggressive, bestial state of mind. I'm going to get mine, get out of my way, with an emotional state of mind where they can feel the joys and the creativity and the love that comes from great culture, from great ideas, from magnificent music. That's one of the reasons why choruses are so powerful as an organizing tool. It's not just, in my humble opinion, because people are working in a group on something. It's much more profound than that, is that they get in touch with an emotion inside themselves that they didn't even know existed. And they feel raised to a level which they wanted to deny themselves access to. Open that up, and people get smart quickly.
Okay, so I know we have a question in Houston, so why don't we go to them?
Hi, Dennis. How are you? This is Keisha.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, so last week you really provoked me in your discussion when the subject matter of which you titled "Turning Cacophony into Harmony" came up, and actually I wrote an article on that. In the aftermath of the recent tragedies in Parkland, the shootings, and the ongoing culture of death to address this. But I wanted to take that up a little bit more in the context of the discussion here today on what is it that we're actually creating in terms of a future of creating a future, not just to say that we want to put an end to this culture of death, but what it is that we're bringing about. And I think this concept of both Leibniz and the pursuit of happiness, and what he actually wrote on public happiness, and also the principles outlined in what the last question was on win-win cooperation, gets at one and the same idea. And so I wanted you to comment on that, because I think what we're dealing with right now is not just a matter of how do you transform this culture that actually seeks to destroy the commitment to bringing about a better future. You're not going to do that by just putting forth penal laws that are going to punish and abolish the existing activities of the culture, but it requires a different sense of this idea of what is the pursuit of happiness? What is it that is in the common interest and the common good of all people, of all nations? And I just, if you take Leibniz and the translation of Leibniz on public happiness, where he goes to the extent of saying whatever is publicly useful is to be done. The common good is valued by the goods of all being collected into one total. It is to be ensured before everything else, so that everyone may be content, so that no pain may be afflicted with people. The next thing is to bring it about so that everyone is happy, i.e., everyone lives the most pleasing way. It is better to be without pleasure than to be afflicted by pain. And he goes on to say that happiness is a state of enduring joy, misery is a state of enduring sadness. But I think one of the things in terms of looking at what Leibniz understands about happiness and the public good, public happiness, is not just what some of those against Leibniz would say, such as Hume and Bertrand Russell and Bentham, that happiness is avoidance of pain and seeking of pleasure. But it is really to this idea of what is happiness based on the commitment to a love for all of mankind. That is the win-win principle. And because because Dr. King has been brought up on this, if you want to really get a sense of what a win-win conception for mankind is, in this idea of unconditional love amongst people, amongst nations, it's not just you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of thing. But it's really deeper than that. And in Dr. King's A Time to Break the Silence, his Vietnam speech, it is very profound, where he says, a genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a nationwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concerns beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is the reality is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. So I just wanted to bring that up because this discussion is continuing to come up on what is a true win-win principle for mankind, and then also that in relationship to what is the true pursuit of happiness. I think it goes together. So if you would address that.
Yeah, sure. The I mean, on this question of happiness as opposed to pleasure, I mean, the happiness as far away, Leibniz's concept of happiness is as far away from the Benthamite idea of pleasure as true love, agape, is from pornography. Right? I mean, that's really the kind of totally, completely distinct, not just somewhat different, but completely distinct concepts. I want to actually, let me just pick up on what you're saying, Keisha, and elaborate what I think is a related question, which is on this issue of the culture of death, that you don't replace the culture of death by laws and penal measures and so on and so forth, and you actually don't end the culture of death or evil in general by simply going after it or something like that. That in fact what is required, and Helge has really emphasized this over and over again, that the key to actually replacing geopolitics or getting rid of geopolitics, making 2018 the year in which we get rid of geopolitics, is that it has to be done by creating a new paradigm. In other words, if you are going to get people to be able to distance themselves from the emotional life and the intellectual life or the mental life related to pleasure seeking, which is addictive and dangerous. I mean, there's no question that human beings can be reduced to the status of beasts. That can be done. What can't be done is you can't do the other. You cannot raise beasts to the status of human beings, but you can turn human beings, degrade them to the point of being beasts. That has happened historically, does happen, and is the danger. But the only way to actually reverse that is by providing people with a new paradigm in the broadest sense of not just win-win in the sense of political relations or something like that, or in economics, but actually a totally different concept of man. That is to say, an emotional life which is based on a new paradigm, which provides them with something which we would associate with the idea of beauty, so that they not only are opposed to the ugliness which surrounds them, the culture of death which surrounds them, but actually can fight against it based on, at first, inklings of, but then a stronger and stronger sense of an actual alternative view of man, an alternative view of culture and beauty, and so on. However, and let me present this as a paradox for people to think about, you cannot do that without destroying evil. You can't do that by just pushing good things. You can't do that by Mr. Nice Guy. You can't do it by not fighting. You can't do it by saying, oh, we just want to create a society in which all people get along well and so on, and so we're not going to get into a fight with a fascist economic system or fighting for development in the third world or tearing down Wall Street and picking a fight with them based on Glass-Steagall. It's this idea which you run across of people who disguise their cowardice in theological robes to argue all you have to do is promote good things and you don't have to fight against bad things. You don't have to really fight against bad things. And I say cowardice because that's what it is, because people don't want to get into trouble. So on the one hand, I say this is somewhat of a paradox, and it has to do with the nature of the relationship between evil and good. And this is not a Manichaean universe. This is not a universe where there's the forces of evil and there's the forces of good. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is what Linda LaRouche has often said, which is you got to kill Satan. Not as individuals, you have to kill Satan as a power and a principality, as an idea, as a concept of man, as Satanism as reflected in the human species. And that's a fight. That takes actually picking a fight with and destroying evil. And so on the one hand, you have to do that by organizing around and building the good, true happiness. On the other hand, you have to make sure that you actually are using that as a weapon to combat and to eliminate once and for all that state of mind and state of society built around it, and that political grouping in the oligarchy that has fostered and defended that evil. So I'll leave that as a thought in people's minds. It's a fairly significant question, I think, as to the relationship between good and evil. I think St. Augustine is actually correct that evil does not have any ontological existence of its own. You have to think of evil as kind of the way you think of darkness as the absence of light. It's not an existence, but it takes on as a political force which must be defeated. So have fun grappling with that one. You'll be in very, very good company in doing that with St. Augustine and Plato and LaRouche and many other people over the centuries.
Okay, so we're now going to go to the conference line. We'll take 2 questions from the conference line, starting with Jim.
Okay, hi, this is Jim. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Going back to the question on is and what ought to be, I flashed on wrestling with Plato's hypotheses, the higher hypotheses, and the hypotheses on the higher hypotheses. Is that and also bringing in the remembrance? We're constantly changing to the higher realm. Would this kind of resemble an answer to that particular question? And also, was it LaRouche or Einstein who said the universe is finite but unbounded? And that brings in the concept of a constant change to the higher realm. So can you expound a little bit on that?
Actually, I think it was both who said that. In answer to your question, yes and no. The way in which it's no, it's not a question of things are progressing to a higher realm in the sense that things are just moving along and things get better and it goes from what is to something that's better and what ought to be and so on and so forth. That's what I was taking issue with in my earlier remarks. I think the way you need to think of this is as something that exists on a different level, on a different plane, not in a different universe, it's in the same universe, but has different metric characteristics, different laws that apply to it in the same way that, for example, with Vernadsky, they coexist, the biosphere and the noosphere and the lithosphere and so on and so forth, but they're characteristic, that is to say, the laws which define their functioning are different. And the laws of the noosphere are not the same as the laws of the biosphere. They're different. They're qualitatively different. It's not just that you advance from one to the other. And in that sense, I think you need to think of human progress as the same sort of thing, and the move from a hypothesis to a higher hypothesis. Man's species nature is his constant advance in the sense that he, in advancing, completely changes his species nature. We become a different species every time, in one sense a different species, every time we move to a different technological platform, for example, where all of the metric relations, economic relations and so on, which applied in the earlier stage, do not apply in the next stage. You can get from the higher level to the lower level, but not vice versa, other than by a creative leap. Right? It's not anything within the facts or the existence of the lower level that leads you inexorably, deterministically, mathematically to the higher level. So I'm saying this because I think there's an underlying problem that showed up in many of the answers to the question on this is-ought question, which reflect that problem. It's not a question of what is and what ought to be. The idea of ought is the idea of man's will and creativity to create a future state. That's what's meant by ought. It's not, oh, I have an idea of how to make things better. That's not the level of this thing. It's that man's creative capability of guiding his present from a concept of the future is a higher order existence and reality than things which merely exist today. So I think what's important.
Would that bring in?
Just let me just finish the thought on this thing, okay? One second, and then I want to hear what you have to say. I think that when you think of Plato, as you were saying before, on the hypothesis, the higher hypothesis, and hypothesizing the higher hypothesis, in the same way, Plato's hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is an entirely different existence and is incommensurable with the hypothesis. It's a different order of things. It's not just more, it's not just better, it's a different animal altogether. So you cannot measure it in the same way. It doesn't have the same characteristics. It doesn't have the same laws, just as you would not try to describe or characterize or measure a man from the standpoint of animals, at least not if you're rational or a thinking person. So that's my only caution, my cautionary note in terms of the way you were formulating your comments a minute ago. But yeah, go ahead. You had something to add?
Well, I was going to say the density of population increase. Now that's for the good of society. Would that come into play, for instance, on your higher hypotheses? Because that's something you're moving towards, your relative density of population, and I'm thinking that is for the good. But would that fall into the category of your hypotheses on the higher hypotheses? Or are we talking something completely different that we know not of at this point? And I guess that
no. The answer to your question is no. It is not the same thing. The question is what is causing the increases of potential relative population density from one stage to the next. That's the question. The increases of potential relative population density are the footprints of a higher order existence which is creating them. Lynn often gives the sort of the as an example, when you're a hunter, you know, and you see footprints in the jungle or something like that, you know, you better start thinking what's causing those footprints. The interesting question is not the footprints. Footprints don't have an existence on their own. What's causing it? And that's the same thing with potential relative population density. Potential relative population density is a metric which reflects a higher order causality which is producing it. That's the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. So that gets right to the point of what I was saying of the right way and the wrong way to think about this thing. What is that characteristic of man's existence which produces a measurable increase of potential relative population density? That's the issue. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, so we're going to go to the next question on the conference line here from Lawrence.
Hi, this is Lawrence Henney. Can you hear me well?
Yep.
Right. Can you hear me better now?
Sounds good.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yeah.
Perfect.
These sets of questions I've been grappling with for about a week now, and I'm getting like a headache. I mean, it's a good thing because the last time I wanted to learn something really bad, I got a headache, and then it went away, and I knew something I didn't know, and it's just completely awesome what I'm thinking. It's been very difficult to actually take what I'm thinking and put it into words. Now, I noticed that you didn't go through, I think that you didn't go through the answers to number 3.
Just briefly.
The questions on number 3, is this correct?
Yeah, just briefly. I just gave one answer from someone who said this is a really stupid and insane argument, which covered the grounds. for our
Well,
purposes.
reading what Bertrand Russell wrote was like horrible. That was I couldn't stand it, and I completely disagreed with a majority of it. And I that was one of the answers to those questions, because it wasn't just one question; it was actually three questions. I had come up with the most profound concepts in my mind and ideas that I tried to write. And I did take a couple quotes from someone, copied and pasted them, and then put them in quotes. I didn't reference
I wasn't
them.
talking. Look, Lawrence, I wasn't talking about you.
I know.
Okay. I'm talking about somebody who literally
I know.
sent back nothing
saying.
but spark notes, literally. So I absolutely was not talking about you. And I did notice, just to confirm what you said, that you sent various iterations and ongoing attempts to deal with these things. That was good. So but go ahead.
Yeah, and one thing I do think about, there's actually two more points I'd like to make. There are certain ideas that when you acquire them, I would say they are yours, and that you really wouldn't have to cite them if you didn't know exactly, but not an entire, writing. I inserted them. The other part was when something I just thought of as I was listening, of a previous meaning of love, is that it's a complete devotion and commitment. And this I had learned probably about 12 years ago, through studying with some missionaries. And to have a complete and unwavering devotion and commitment to even those who may have potentially acquired or accepted evil would change things quite a bit, I'd say. And that's pretty much all I'd like to say, but I'd like to go over three, because it's just every time I go over it, it's just more and more, and it's like more ingrained as to like this higher truth. It's so awesome.
Right. Let me say two things about your comments. First of all, a general comment for everybody, which is that just because I didn't put up a particular response or from different individuals, that's not the end of the story. I will make an effort, along with help from Megan and hopefully Ben and others, Jason, to send some answers as well to people in writing, to keep the discussion going, because I think it's important, because people have really made some serious efforts on this thing. So I want to continue with that. But let me say something else sparked by what you were commenting on, this question of love and what you learned by missionaries and so on and so forth. And I'm going to say something which is going to be perhaps polemical with some people. Hopefully, will be
missionaries.
Okay, no. Perhaps polemical with some people. Maybe not with you. But I think needs to be said. It is not sufficient to be morally committed to use your life to change the world. That's good. And it's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition to live your life well. In addition to that, you have to not only decide you want to dedicate your life to a higher purpose, along the lines of what we've discussed here, you additionally have to determine what is scientifically provable as the most effective way to do that. And what you will find among a lot of people who are actually very moral and very committed, and one can hardly fault their idea of wanting to help people and do things with their life, they will tend to fall short on the second aspect. And that's a very political question. You have to determine how to spend the coin which you have been given, how to use your life, how to use the brief period of our physical existence on this earth to do something of universal, lasting, eternal importance. And that's a scientific question. It's not merely a moral question described as, I want to do something good. You have to educate yourself both morally as well as scientifically to figure out, okay, how can I do that? How can I best do that? school teachers. School teachers are great. Doctors are great. They're people who are, nurses. They're trying to do something with their lives. But unless we destroy the British Empire and stop the City of London and stop Wall Street and stop the coup d'etat against President Trump, we are going to have a situation where there are not going to be any children left to teach, where no matter how rapidly a doctor cures people, more and more people are going to be killed by disease, by hunger, by war, and so on, than all the doctors in the world could possibly cure. So it's not to besmirch doctors or nurses or teachers or people who do very wonderful things with their lives. But each of us have got to determine, okay, how can I have the maximum impact with my life? However long it is, however short it is, how can I have the maximum impact on the future potential relative population density of our species 1,000,000 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, or even 50 years from now? That'll do. What do I have to do? How am I going to spend my time? What am I going to do with my life? And that's a very personal question, which only you can answer for yourself. And I don't just mean you, Larry. I mean you, everyone who's participating in this discussion, all of us as well. What do you do? And that's a scientific question. And that's where the issue of the role of Lyndon LaRouche in particular, as a personality, as a thinker, as a scientist, as a political leader of the 20th and the 21st century, is absolutely central and essential. And I challenge anyone who has had the opportunity to think about these matters and study these matters closely to find a more effective way to fully deploy your morality than through the activities of the LaRouche movement, through our organization. There is none. I'm convinced of that, obviously. I wouldn't have done what I did, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think that. I'm sure that that's the case with, if not all, certainly most of the people who are participating in the discussion, which is why you're on this discussion. But it's an issue which I think we have to put into very clear focus and present to others as well. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? That famous cartoon, which LaRouche always talks about, when they take you out of here, someone drew a cartoon of this, and they take you out of here, and you're in the casket, and they're carrying you out. And the cartoon is you're given one last moment of consciousness, and the guy in the casket gets up on his elbow, and he says, "What was that all about?" That's the question.
Well, we've come up on time.
Yeah, Dennis.
If it's very brief and you want to add something, we're pretty much out of time. Oh, that's okay. I think we... Lawrence, anyway, if you want to email in whatever you were going to follow up with, we accidentally kicked you out of the queue, but I think that's a great place to end anyway. Do you want to add anything else?
Nope.
Okay. So I'd like to thank...
Wait, there is one thing I want to add.
Yeah.
You got to keep coming back to the other classes. These things were thought of and put together as not one class or even two classes, but as a single unified concept. Hopefully not cacophony, but harmony. So really important, keep coming back to the next classes and all of them. And hopefully I'll add my vote to the pressure tactics that were waged in the very first or second class on Helga, that she should please do us the favor of addressing the final session of this course.
Well, in that case, I'll say now, make my plug now for next week's class.
There you go.
So please, next week's class, class number 4, is going to be taught by John Segerson, who's the music director for the Schiller Institute, longtime political organizer with our movement and collaborator of LaRouche. And he'll be teaching the class on beauty and freedom versus the CCF, diving into the real principles of classical culture, classical music, and why it is not an option, but a necessary part of the new paradigm without which we won't succeed. So that's going to be next week at 2 p.m. Eastern, not 7. We're going back to our afternoon slot for the remaining classes and follow-up discussions. So 2 p.m. Eastern next time. So with that, I'll thank our live audiences in Detroit and Houston, and thank all of you who called in and the rest of you watching online. And we will see you all very soon.